Okay, we're going to do three things in this talk. The first is to review the situation that we find ourselves in today in relation to speak and disarmament. And the second is to go back and look at some of the historical stuff that's happened over the last few decades. And the third is to look at the fight that we've got on our hands. I think it is a fight. I'm going to adopt some kind of military uh, terminology during this talk just to set it up. And really, I think the first section is going to be a bit of a cross between Dad's army and the general who stands in front of his troops and surveys the scene and tries to work out what the situation is on the battlefield. Okay, so let's begin with that first section. Now, the situation I think most of us would perceive is something like this, that you've got in Britain and elsewhere, but you've got in Britain some peace activists who are, on the whole, protesters and protest at a variety of events like arms fairs and so on. And they're in a minority, and on the whole, they don't count for much. And the majority system is one where the military are accepted and honoured and part of the establishment, and have been that way for 100 years. And very much the protesters are outsiders, are a small minority, and don't really count. And so if you took an outside assessment of this particular event here, as compared to what might happen at Arsenal Stadium or the U2 Arena or whatever, we're a straggly little group that don't count for much, made up of odds and ends, and we're at the fringe of things, and this is not going to be a world-changing experience. Okay, and effectively, we're defeated. And even if you look at the history of peace movements, we could go back and look to a range of other periods when they've been much more successful, much more dominant, and all the rest of it. Now, they're fairly marginal and don't count for much. And there's another agenda too, and I think this is a very important discussion that we ought to have, because I think most of us are taught to feel this way. I was taught to feel this way most of my life, and unlearning things is one of the most difficult tasks in life. You have to unlearn something that's been embedded in you, and it takes a long while. And broadly, the understanding is that arms are realistic, you have to have arms, you have to have the military, and the peace people are idealistic and unrealistic and out of touch. Okay, just savor that for a moment. We're idealistic, out of touch. This isn't the way life is. You've got to wise up, and we're particularly stupid in pursuing this peace line, whereas the military line is realistic, whether you're in the United States or the USSR or all the rest of it. Now, I think this needs unpacking. And what I want to suggest is that actually, if you look at world history over the last 150 years, what you've got in terms of the military is the biggest failed experiment that there's ever been on the planet. So something like 200 million people have died in war-related deaths during that period. Okay, now to lose that many people is quite a big mistake. And it's gone on in war after war after war. And the recipe that weapons make you safe, the ideology that weapons make you safe, hasn't worked time and time again all through that period. And it's not just a failed experiment in terms of the number of people who've been killed and the incidents of war, but it's also a failed experiment in terms of the way life is, because actually what happens is that most of the time, in most places, people live peacefully, and actually peacefully is on the whole the only way to live and get on. On the whole, it helps on the motorways when people don't get out of their cars and have fights. The traffic moves much more smoothly. London works on the whole on the basis that you don't fight in shops and bring out guns in order to get the stuff that you want to buy. So whatever context you take, normally peace is a good part of everyday life. It's realistic, it's the way we live, it's the way we're meant to live, and most of the time this is the way we understand life to be. And we go further in that if children fight in the playground, we say to them, grow up, don't fight, grow up, don't fight. This is a silly way to conduct your affairs. Learn to get on with the people in your playground. Now, if it's good for the playground, then it's good for international relations. But on the whole, we don't ever make that jump. So all the peaceful situations of everyday life are ones that are not transferred to the international scene. And instead, what happens on the international scene is that we've been taught by fear to believe that somehow or other weapons are the only way of sorting this problem out. And let's take it a stage further. I think the economics are very interesting to me in that it's quite clear, first of all, that wars are very costly. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that we finished paying back our debts to the States for the Second World War. We've been paying them back for 50 or 60 years. And so wars cost billions of pounds. The Iraq War, I think, is coming in at 2 or 3 trillion pounds. That's 2 or 3 thousand billion pounds. So wars are very, very costly. They're also costly in terms of work, in that if you think of the people killed, if you think of the people engaged in the armed services not doing any work, if you think of people waging weapons, if you think of the work that the people who are dead and injured, often young, able people, would have done for the next 30 or 40 years, you come up with amazing figures of billions of years of work wasted in the 2 world wars. Now that all adds up to a pretty disastrous failure. Or economically, just in case you're not convinced, I think the salutary lesson on this issue is to be found in Japan and Germany after the Second World War. So Japan and Germany both deeply devastated by the wars, by atomic bombs, the bombing of Hiroshima, and so on and so forth. Germany bombed city after city after city, and so on, deeply devastated. And in 1945, they were forbidden to have weapons, they were forbidden to make weapons, they were forbidden to have any military, and the military closed down. By about 1965, 20 years later, 25 years later, who were the 2 leading world economies? And they just happened to be Japan and Germany. Why? Well, Japan had managed to make cameras and a whole range of electronic goods that were superb, and so on and so forth. Germany, brilliant engineering applied, export trade booming, and so both of them had done very well, partly by transferring their economic activity from the military into civilian production, but also because if you look at 2, 3, 4, 5% compound that you spend year in, year out, paying people to march up and down, and paying the military system to sit there, Sergeant Bilko-wise, doing stuff year in, year out, that's an incredible military waste. So when you take that compound 3, 4, 5% for Japan and Germany, it's no wonder that their economies moved ahead over those 20 years when they weren't investing all this wasted stuff in the military. So I think we have to come to the conclusion that militarism, idealistic, wars don't work. It's the biggest failure on the planet. It destroys things it destroys things on a marvelous scale. So if you want to, it's the opposite of green. So if you want to save energy, what do? You let off a bomb, you make a bomb, you make a bomber, you let off a bomb. You then have to clear up the mess created by the bomb, and you use energy in all those stages. So however you evaluate this, this is an abject failure. It's the long, big, failed experiment. And we have got to turn the tables. And first of all, it's a mental transformation. Peace is realistic. Warfare, militarism has been unrealistic. It's been unrealistic, especially throughout the whole modern period. And so we are sitting here not as fringe people, but really as, if you like, the people who are occupying the obvious establishment position that peace works and war does not. I had a teacher who always used to say, God is the thesis and never the antithesis. Now, there's a great place for protest, and I'm with it all the way. But in a sense, when we're working for peace, we're working on the thesis of human existence, not the antithesis. We're not always with our backs to the wall. We're not fighting for something that is not central to human existence and we cannot believe in. The good news is the right news, is the truth. So that's the introduction. And I'll say a bit more about that in section 3. But there's a lot of transformation that needs to happen in terms of the rhetoric that we develop to look at all of this stuff. Now, what I've tried to do in this morning and this afternoon is look at the history of Western militarism, especially as led by the arms trade. Okay, I for most of my life had rather a fatalistic attitude to war. Wars just seem to happen; they can't be explained. Okay, and isn't this dreadful? And you wring your hands, and that's all you do. But of course, wars can be explained. There is a truth here, a true understanding of wars. And the question is, who need wars? And the obvious answer to that is the arms companies need wars, because without wars, they're out of business. If there are wars, they're both in business and they're making very big profits. And so the arms companies need wars, and actually they've been very successful in generating them for the last 150 years, and we can see that time and time again. They actually generate wars, and they've influenced people to do it, and they have a range of techniques. They scare people, and the place of fear in all of this is very, very important. They bribe people, so bribery has occurred right up to, we'll look a bit at the BAE Systems bribery that occurred in a short while. They are inside government. They say that every new weapon will be the one that will sort it out. Gas warfare was going to be the one that would sort it out, and it was actually a more humane weapon than the others. There's all this goes on, and they get alliances with the military, with the capitalists, and so on and so forth, to promote their way of doing things and seeing things. You know, this will be the answer. The drone will be the answer, because it means that you don't have your own soldiers put at risk, and you can just go in with the drone and wipe people out. Isn't that marvelous? So every new weapon system that comes along is promoted and sold through the media, through all kinds of people who are linked into the system and who are paid by that. So, you know, we were discussing earlier about arms companies that have got links into our education system in terms of institutes and all the rest of it. Wherever you look, in universities, if you look underneath, there's often arms money that's behind it. So this is the pattern, and it's been going on all the way through. Now, I mean, in one sense, this morning's session, we looked at World War One, and I've got to condense that to about 90 seconds. So the First World War was 4 arms races generated by the arms companies, mainly the arms companies of Britain, France, Germany, and Japan was involved, and so on, and Austro-Hungary, Skoda in Austro-Hungary. Okay, any one of those could have ignited the conflict. Actually, it was the Russia, Austro-Hungary, Serbia one that did, through the murder of Archduke Ferdinand. And once that had gone off, all the others went off at the same time, and we had a world war. And 16 million people died, and a further 50 million in the flu that was spread by the returning troops as they went. So this massive tragedy that changed the history of Europe came from the arms trade. And this was acknowledged by all the major statesmen. 4 prime ministers acknowledged this, that the cause of the First World War was the private trade of arms. Okay, and the Second World War was no different from that. I've, for most of my life, thought, and on the basis of my study, Hitler caused the Second World War. Wasn't that dreadful? Hitler was an evil man. Immediately, that was true. You know, Hitler came to power after 33, and after that, it was true. But let me just read you a passage that, in a sense, fills it out. And this is a passage from the American ambassador to the President, Roosevelt. Much as I believe in peace as our best policy, I cannot avoid the fears which Wilson emphasized more than once in conversations with me. The breakdown of democracy in all of Europe will be a disaster to the people, but what can you do? At the present moment, this is when Hitler is in power, this is in 1936. At the present moment, more than 100 American corporations have subsidiaries here or cooperative understandings. The DuPonts have 3 allies in Germany that are aiding in the armament business. Their chief ally is the IG Farben company, a part of the government which gives 200 marks a year to one propaganda organization operating on American opinion. Standard Oil New Jersey sent $2 billion here in December 1933 and has made $500,000 a year helping Germans make ersatz gas for war purposes. But Standard Oil cannot take any of its earnings out of the country except in goods. They do little of this, reporting their earnings at home, but do not explain the facts. The International Harvester Company president told me their business here rose 33% a year, arms manufacturer, I believe, but they could take nothing out. Even our airplanes people have secret arrangement with Krupps. General Motor Company and Ford do enormous businesses here through their subsidiaries and take no profits out. I mention these facts because they complicate things and add to war dangers. So that just gives you the situation. They're in 36. A load of big American military arms munitions companies are there supplying Hitler on a very large scale, effectively rearming him for the Second World War. Okay, without those arms, without that input, Germany would have nothing like the military strength that they eventually had in 39, and the whole history of the war would have been different. So the arms manufacturers are pushing it all the time. They destroyed the great Geneva Disarmament Conference of 1932 when the American President Hoover had offered on the table to cut all American arms by a third and to eliminate all the offensive weapons, and asked all the other countries of the world to do it. And if that great conference had succeeded, it was backed by half the population of the world who signed up in various petitions and through the organizations that they represented. If that had gone through, Hitler wouldn't have come to power. And you also have the fact that fascism was created partly by the arms companies and the capitalists who wanted the fascists to create the disorder that you needed a military government to cover up. So again, with the Second World War, I was amazed when eventually I had to come to this conclusion. The Second World War has the same cause as the First World War, and a lot of it has to do with the arms companies and their promoting their business and preventing peace breaking out. But then we get the Cold War, and we looked a bit at that this morning, but I want to jump straight through to the Reagan era and the troubles in the Middle East. So we're talking kind of 1979 or whenever, and by this stage, you don't just have the arms companies, but you have a range of linked institutions. I'm talking particularly about the United States. The linked institutions are, of course, the Pentagon, built during the war, which became the revolving door place where the arms companies came in and got their orders and went out, and they worked with the Pentagon and so on. And you also have the CIA that very often was moving weapons around the world in various places. Okay, now the shocking thing, and this really is the shocking thing about the prehistory of Afghanistan. You know the history of Afghanistan, and in the modern era it begins with 9/11. So Al Qaeda attack the buildings. Isn't this terrible? And we go in. The prehistory is that Brzezinski, who was President Carter's Secretary of State, said to Carter, and this is one of the few mistakes that Carter made. I think otherwise he was a great president, and he tried to cut down on arms, and he really was pushed out of office because he tried to cut down on arms, but that's another story. But Brzezinski said to Carter, if we can make Afghanistan into the USSR's Vietnam, we can destroy them. And from that time, the CIA moved into Afghanistan with training groups to be effectively terrorists against the USSR, equipping them with weapons, especially the things that shot down low-flying planes and so on. And they pushed in $2 or $3 billion of training, equipment, and so on into Afghanistan, and began the militarization, effectively, of that country. And I want you to think of thousands of people who've learnt nothing in their lives except to be gun-touting militarists. And this is what they were, effectively, first of all, during that long war with the USSR, and then when they ran out on the USSR, of course, various groups like Al Qaeda just carried on, and we got the troubles that occurred there. Now, and this is but one example of many that I could take. I'm going to bring up one or two more. What we get is this Western transmission of militarism around the world, creating the problems which we then have to solve. Okay, now the arms companies don't mind, because once you've created the problem out there, then you can sell more arms at home to address the problem that's out there. So it's great for them. It's a double whammy. But this is what was going on. Now the second case, I passed by Iran and the arming of the Shah of Persia, and the Iran-Contra deal that Reagan did with the Iranians in 1980. But that was shady beyond belief and illegal. And I move on third to the Iraq situation. And basically in Iraq, of course, the West armed Saddam Hussein. And they armed Saddam Hussein, although they knew he was a dangerous military dictator, and the arms flowed in. They flowed in from the United States, from Germany, from France. We sent the supergun, but actually we observed the the official embargo more strictly than most other countries, so fewer weapons flowed from Britain than other countries. But Saddam was armed on a massive scale. And there was one famous occasion, of course, you've probably seen the picture, where Donald Rumsfeld, who's a very bizarre character, Donald Rumsfeld goes over to Saddam and offered what is called agricultural aid, but really it's aid to buy weapons. And so Rumsfeld is handing over a large sum. I won't say the sum because I can't remember it accurately, but he hands over a large sum of money to Saddam, so that Saddam can buy yet more weapons from the United States. And Saddam is armed. Now, of course, the rules are that when you're a military dictator and you're armed by the United States, you have the weapons to play with, and you're not supposed to use them. I mean, using them is just not acceptable. But Saddam hadn't quite worked out those rules, and so he invaded Kuwait. Now, the reason he invaded Kuwait was that the French, who had sold him a lot of weapons and were a bit keen on getting their money back, were pressing him hard for cash. And so Saddam asked the Kuwaitis for $10 billion. Okay, he cooked up a few favors that he thought the Kuwaitis owed. And actually, I mean, if you follow the correspondence through and so on, the Kuwaitis were quite generous. They were prepared to go up to $6 billion that they were going to give him, which seems to me to be fairly generous. But it wasn't enough for Saddam, and so he invaded. And then suddenly the West woke up to this fact that the person that they had armed, and armed on a very large scale, had invaded an oil country that would make his oil fiefdom very large, and we then went to war against Saddam in the first Iraq War, and that's what went on. Now, the arms companies, of course, then used that first Iraq War, and this again happens frequently in wars, as part of the picture for the arms companies. Wars are showcases for weapons, and if you can use a new generation of weapons that will be successful, then you can push them hard. You can sell them around the world and so on. So they used smart weapons and all kinds of other things. And Saddam was defeated at the cost of oil fields being set alight and all kinds of stuff like that. And then, of course, we got the second Iraq War, which was basically cooked up. And it was cooked up because I think, and it will be interesting to see whether this comes out in the Iraq inquiry report when it finally it appears. I think they knew there were no weapons there. And the reason was the reporting of a chap called Hussein Kamal, who was Saddam's son-in-law and also head of the armed forces in Iraq. And he defected to the West, but his wife stayed in Iraq. And he gave interviews to the Russian, the American, the UN representatives, saying that he'd destroyed the weapons. Okay, and I'd read all these before we went to war in Iraq the second time, and it seemed to me quite clear that this chap was authoritative, and he'd stated that the weapons had been destroyed in the early 90s, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. Okay, but of course, going to war against a guy who's already got no weapons and whom you can easily defeat is another no-no for the arms companies. And yeah, it's a yes for the arms companies, and they went in, and we had the second Iraq War, and all that follows from that, the chaos that follows from that, because always war is chaos upon chaos. And by that second Iraq War, of course, the nature of war had changed. So what happened during that Iraq War was that there were actually more private munitions and private employee people like working for firms like Halliburton and so on, than there were soldiers on the ground. So war has, to a considerable extent, in the last few decades, been privatized. So it's no longer mainly done by the military, it's being done by a whole range of companies that are quasi-war or military companies and so on, and that all goes on. And I want you to just dwell with the absolute absurdity of this when you come up with somebody like Donald Rumsfeld, who, having been there with Saddam, giving him aid on the large scale to sell weapons, then later is running a war against this guy who actually, well, he hadn't done anything, had he? He hadn't got the weapons of mass destruction. But Rumsfeld led the war, and interestingly, Rumsfeld led the war to some extent in opposition to the Pentagon, who wanted to fight a conventional war and probably would have done things much better. But Rumsfeld operated through these private companies. So essentially what we get at the end of that war is enough crisis for the whole of the country to become a dysfunctional state. And of course, what happened when the war took place was that a whole load of the arsenals that Saddam had were looted by the Iraqis. They got the weapons and equipment to carry on fighting, and we've had the chaos generated there. So this is what's been going on. To a considerable extent, we hold up our hands looking at all these tragedies that have occurred, the tragedy in Afghanistan, the tragedy in Iraq. We could say exactly the same thing about the tragedy in Libya, created, I'm afraid, by Tony Blair. And essentially they've been generated by us and by the initiatives of the arms companies who are trying to push their trade and sell weapons around the world. And selling weapons around the world, we're told, is good for us because it helps our exports and it keeps our weapons industry strong. And we operate on, we were discussing earlier, we operate on the model where, like the Americans do, that we're all safer if we have 2 guns under our pillow. That's the way to live, isn't it? And similarly, we're creating a fully armed world system where everything can blow up at any stage if any of these arms are used, and so on. And this is the system that has failed time and time again, and we're going through the same motions. Lots of people are deeply uneasy about it, but a certain psychology holds it in place. And I think we just have to look at this and face it directly on. And it's the psychology really of Remembrance Day. And basically at Remembrance Day, we all want to honour the dead. And you know what that means in family after family and situation after situation, in war after war, and what it means in our national psyche as the poppy petals come down in the Albert Hall on the eve of Remembrance Day. There must be a valid reason why these people died. Okay, now I think we have to work through that psychological thing. And I think the best way of doing it is the Second World War, which is the focal one really in most of the British psychological thinking. It occurs almost every day on television if you bother to watch. It occurs in event after event. And the psychology is this. Of course, when Hitler is in power and the Second World War is inevitable, and even Churchill said as late as 1936 or 1937 that could have been prevented, Second World War could have been prevented. Okay, then it was inevitable. But we go back to the Irishman who was asked the way and said, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. You can always stop a war 10 years earlier. There is a range of things that we do that are unwise and stupid and involve travelling down the wrong road, which would prevent the war and would mean that all of these people didn't have to die. And really, from the view of this longer term, this war was a mistake and their death was a mistake. And of course, many of the wives of soldiers who've died know that their husband's death was a mistake, or now even their wife's death was a mistake. And so we've got to take hold of that Remembrance Day thing and rethink it at a deep level and refeel it as part of the British population. But let's come back to the third section now and look at how we fight. How are we going to fight this great system? And on the whole, I think it's fairly easy because we just go back to Paul. Well, we first of all go back to Jesus, and I mean, all of what I've said really is centered on that one sentence of Jesus that I think is so overwhelmingly the analysis of modern Western political culture, international culture. Those who take the sword will perish by the sword. If you go this route, you will perish. It's as simple as that, or as deep as that. But Paul also says, we fight not against flesh and blood. It's not people we're fighting against, but we fight against principalities and powers and systems. And the system is the arms trade and the military systems that have been constructed around it and in association with it. But Paul also talked about the armour of God, and I think quite deliberately talked about the armour of God in contradistinction to the Roman armour. So what is the armour of God? It involves truth-telling. It involves the breastplate of righteousness. It involves feet shod with the gospel of peace. And we have to fight with the armour. And I don't think that's too difficult. Telling the truth is just uncovering the stuff that's going on that just doesn't make sense and involves a wrong way of doing things and seeing things. So for example, if we look at the history of Libya, we've not only got Blair's involvement, but it's quite clear that when Cameron became Prime Minister, partly within the Thatcherite glow, he wanted to engage in Libya, and so he engaged there with Typhoon fighters were sent over. It was a showcase thing for the Typhoon fighters, and some weapons, I think mainly from the French, not so much from the British, but some weapons moved into Libya, and Libya was liberated, and we were told he was a democratic state. But again, what comes out is not a democratic state, but an arm-ridden state that is being crucified on its own militarism. So mistake after mistake we can identify. We can identify the stuff that's hidden and is revealed. The Guardian did this with BAE Systems. They showed that billions of pounds was being paid to the Saudi princes so that we could carry on with our arms deal with Saudi Arabia. It involved peacock blue Rolls Royces. It involved hiring a Boeing 747 so that the Saudi princes and their wives could bring their shopping back from California to Saudi Arabia. It involved issuing them all with gold and silver dinner services so that they could eat their meals with forks and spoons and knives that were made of in gold or silver, except they all turned down the silver ones and took the gold ones, and they had a surplus of silver ones left over. All of this was going on, and BAE Systems has a series of corruption charges set alongside it that are part of the way we British people have operated in the arms trade around the world. Okay, we can expose this, and we can expose it in peace. We're not fighting anybody, but we're fighting principalities and powers and systems. And the fight can grow, and it can be informed. And it can be informed because this is, first of all, a failed experiment. It's wrongly motivated. It's motivated mainly by mammon and riches, because these companies have and do make fantastic profits, and the whole thing is waiting to fall. And what's needed is a fairly simple arrangement that is can be put in place and agreed by everybody. And the one I've come up with is a pattern where you have a 10% cuts a year multilaterally around the world for all countries in their military spending, their forces and their weapons. Until in a decade, it's all gone. So if all other countries are reducing their weapons, you're under a decreasing threat of any arms confrontation from other countries, and the thing can just peacefully fall. Just as you have an arms race, you can have an arms declension until it's all gone. You can have thorough policing to sort out terrorists. You can have absolutely transparent coverage of all of this because we can find weapons anywhere, and you can have open access to make sure that wherever there's any doubt about weapons, people can come in and sort it out. And this could be done, provided you don't put the military in charge of disarmament, coming up with a disarmament formula. If you ask generals to disarm, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas and they won't do it. But we could do this, and the Christian community especially could do this. We have 2 billion Christians worldwide, and we need to do this, and we need to do it as a major form of the transmission of a shared peaceful faith that will put the lamb on the throne rather than the military on the throne. And I just think there's one gesture that conveys what this would be, and if you want to do it, I ask you to join in. Okay, if somebody points a gun at you, the conventional attitude is to put your hands up and say, I have no guns, by putting your hands up. It seems to me that if we can get half the population of the world to put their hands up, then disarmament can happen. So I'm just going to do a trial run here. Those of you who are really convinced that disarmament, strategic multilateral disarmament around the world is a good thing, would you like with me to put your hands up? You're under no pressure at all, but if you feel like it. Okay. You're a biased sample, but we're on the road. Bless you.